she smelled. That's the truth no tapestry will show you. The medieval woman you've seen in paintings, the one with the luminous skin and the glossy braided hair, serene in her stone tower, smelling of something floral. She is a fiction, a beautiful, persistent, completely invented fiction. The real woman stood in a one-room structure housing 6 people and sometimes a goat. She had not bathed in 6 weeks. Her hair was wrapped in linen, not for elegance, but to keep the lice contained. Her teeth were cleaned this morning with a strip of used cloth and ash from last night's fire. She was 23 years old and had already buried 2 children. By the end of this video, the way you think about medieval women will have changed permanently. Not because the history is merely interesting, because the history is true, and the truth is more detailed, more physical, and more systematically brutal than anything you've been shown before. These were real women, millions of them, across 10 centuries of European history, living inside a world that gave them almost nothing and took almost everything. And yet they built functional lives, functional hygiene from cloth and ash and collective whispered knowledge passed mother to daughter in the dark. This is what that actually looked like. Picture the image you already carry. You've absorbed it without knowing it, through every period drama, every fairy tale, every pre-Raphaelite painting you've ever half-glanced at in a museum. She's there, the medieval woman, linen dress, long hair loose around her shoulders or elegantly braided, clear skin, the smell of herbs in the room. She moves through her day with a kind of unhurried grace, washing her face at a basin of clean water, perhaps brushing something fragrant through her hair before kneeling in prayer. Hold that image. We're going to take it apart piece by piece. First, the hair. In the illuminated manuscripts, those gorgeously detailed medieval illustrations that historians use as primary visual sources, women's hair appears as a glossy, controlled cascade, perfect, clean, even in domestic scenes, even in agricultural scenes. But manuscripts were made by monks for wealthy patrons. In monastery scriptoriums that had nothing in common with the daily life of the 90% of medieval Europe's population that worked the land. The manuscript image of a woman is not a document, it is an ideal. And ideals, by definition, tell you what people wished for, not what people had. The reality of medieval hair was this: it was washed at best once every few weeks. More often, in the winter months, it went months without full washing. The reasoning was not laziness. The reasoning was survival. Heating enough water to wash hair required gathering sufficient firewood that was often scarce, often rationed, often needed for cooking or for keeping the family from freezing. After the water was heated, there was the matter of drying. Hair drying in a stone structure with one unglazed window opening onto a cold morning took most of the day. Damp hair was widely believed by physicians, midwives, and folk tradition alike to invite illness by allowing cold air to enter through weakened or open pores. Whether or not that was medically accurate is beside the point. The belief was real, and the fear was rational given that a winter illness could kill. So she wore a cap, linen mostly, sometimes wool, wrapped tightly around the head, covering the hair from the roots to the ears. This was modesty, yes? An unmarried woman's loose hair carried specific social meaning. A married woman's covered hair carried different social meaning. But the cap was also technology. It was a lid. It kept smoke and dust and cooking ash and insects out of the hair. It extended the time between washings. It was, in the language of constrained ingenuity, an elegant solution. Now, the skin. The myth gives her clear, pale, glowing skin. The reality offered her a choice between 2 things she could not fully afford: washing, which required water and fuel, or cosmetics, which required ingredients not everyone could access. Most women managed with neither. The daily practice, The standard functioning practice of medieval female hygiene was the cloth wipe, a dampened piece of linen run across the face, the neck, the underarms, the hands, the feet, sometimes with water that had been infused with rosemary or lavender, not for luxury, but because these plants were available, inexpensive, and believed by the medicine of the era to carry mild purifying properties. The cloth was then rinsed, dried, used again, and again, until it disintegrated. This was not a degraded substitute for bathing. This was the system. This was how hygiene worked for most women across most of medieval European history. And the smell. We need to talk about the smell. A single-room peasant structure in the 12th century, stone or timber walls, earthen floor, straw spread across it for insulation and comfort, renewed irregularly, decomposing gradually underfoot. A hearth in the center with no chimney, smoke rising and finding its own way out through a roof opening, or not finding its way out, and simply accumulating in the air. A family of 4 to 7 people. In winter, sometimes a goat or pig sheltered inside for warmth. The animal's body heat was not negligible, and the alternative was a dead animal and less food. Chamber pots emptied in the morning into outdoor pits. Tallow candles made from rendered animal fat, providing the only light after dark, burning with a characteristic smell that modern people encountering it for the first time describe as deeply unpleasant. Wool, everywhere, on everyone, which when wet has a smell of its own. Food preparation happening in the same room where people slept, where animals were sheltered, where waste was collected. Into this environment place the wooden tub, a barrel-diameter vessel, rarely large enough to immerse a full adult body. To fill it required carrying water from a well or stream, perhaps 15 minutes walk each way, multiple trips, each bucket weighing close to 30 pounds. To heat it required an hour of sustained fire. The process consumed most of a morning. And then the order. The male head of household bathed first, in the freshest, warmest water, then the older sons, then after them the women and girls. By the time the last woman stepped into that tub, if she stepped into it at all, the water was lukewarm. It was cloudy. It was visibly gray. She bathed in what the rest of her family had left behind. This was not considered degrading. This was simply the order of things, unquestioned, unremarkable. The natural expression of a hierarchy so complete it did not need to announce itself. Wake before the light. The children are already stirring on the straw pallet. The fire needs feeding. The water needs fetching. There is no morning routine in the modern sense. No dedicated period carved out for personal hygiene, no bathroom to retreat to, no privacy. The body is managed in the corners of other tasks. While the fire builds, she runs the damp cloth across her face. While the water heats for porridge, she tends to her underarms. The cloth goes back into its bundle. The bundle goes into the corner with the comb and the small clay pot of herb-infused oil. That bundle is her entire hygiene kit. It contains, in most households, one comb, bone or wood, sometimes with missing teeth, 2 or 3 strips of worn linen cut from a shift that had become too thin to wear, a small container of oil, pressed herbs and animal fat, lavender if she was fortunate, plain fat if she wasn't, perhaps a twist of dried rosemary, perhaps a small stoppered bottle of vinegar. That is everything, no more and nothing less. The teeth come first because the mouth is the part that others can detect at close range and the part that social interaction most directly exposes. No toothbrush. The preferred implement was a small twig, hazel or willow, preferred for the texture of the fiber when chewed, soft enough not to damage gums, fibrous enough to act on the tooth surface. She chews the end until it frays. She rubs it across her teeth, working each surface. Salt, if available, was rubbed into the gum line, a rough but functional antibacterial. Some women used a strip of linen wrapped around a finger. Some used ash from the fire, mixed to a gritty paste with water and applied by hand. Dried sage, ground to powder, was considered excellent. It had a strong flavor and was genuinely believed to have purifying properties, and it wasn't entirely wrong. Sage contains compounds with antimicrobial activity, not enough to prevent gum disease, which was prevalent across all social classes, but not nothing either. Tooth decay, counterintuitively, was less common among peasants than the nobility. Peasant diets were heavy in coarse grains and vegetables, almost entirely free of refined sugar, an expensive import available only to the wealthy. Sugar destroyed noble teeth at a rate that contemporary portraits occasionally betray, blackened stumps behind a closed-mouthed smile. The peasant woman's teeth survived longer, but gum disease got her eventually, and when a tooth needed to come out, it was removed by a family member or traveling barber surgeon without anesthetic, using whatever implement was available. The hair was the longest problem, not the washing, the maintenance. Between washings, which might be spaced 3 weeks or 3 months apart, depending on season, the primary tool was the comb. Lice were not a marker of unusual poverty or exceptional filth. They were a near-universal condition across all social classes in medieval Europe. Kings had lice. Nuns had lice. The Queen of France had lice. What varied between classes was not the presence of lice, but the quality of the comb used to remove them, and the availability of herbal treatments applied to the scalp. Rosemary and thyme, boiled and applied as a rinse, were common anti-parasitic measures. They worked imperfectly, but they were what existed. By firelight in the evening, she would comb. The children first, running the teeth through their hair, checking for eggs along the hairline, removing what she found between her fingernails, then herself, as best she could reach. The cap went back on before she slept. The cap came off briefly in the morning for the same combing, and the cycle continued, week after week, season after season. Now, menstruation. There were no manufactured products. There was no pharmacy. There was no such thing as a menstrual product designed for the purpose. What existed was cloth, folded, layered, worn cloth, cut from old shifts, old bed linens, worn aprons. The fabric was repurposed rather than discarded because, in a world of scarcity, fabric was not thrown away. It was used until it dissolved. The pads were held in place by the friction of layered clothing, by the tightness of undergarments, by the press of multiple skirts. In circumstances of greater poverty, soft straw was used, dried moss, wool, whatever was absorbent and available, wrapped in a scrap of fabric and positioned as best it could be. The used cloth was washed by hand, scrubbed with water, with wood ash as an alkaline cleanser, sometimes with vinegar, and dried in private. Social codes around menstrual shame were strict and consistent. Drying cloths at a window where they might be seen was not done. The washing was private, hurried, managed in the margin of other tasks, and the taboos surrounding menstruation extended beyond shame into active prohibition. In many regions across medieval Europe, menstruating women were considered ritually impure in ways that had concrete, practical consequences. Barred from the kitchen, particularly from baking bread, because folk tradition held that a menstruating woman's presence would prevent the dough from rising. Barred from tending to livestock in some communities on the same basis. Barred from entering the church. Barred from handling sacred objects. Barred from contact with the sick or newborn. These were not fringe beliefs. They were embedded in community practice, enforced by social judgment, reinforced by ecclesiastical teaching. A woman who violated them was not just non-compliant, she was a danger. And the girls. Girls who reached menarche with no preparation, no instruction, no explanation. Knowledge about menstruation was transmitted through oral tradition, mother to daughter, neighbor to neighbor, during shared work, in fragments. In many households, even this minimal transmission was accompanied by shame. The event was not discussed directly. It was demonstrated and acknowledged without language adequate to the reality. A girl's first period arrived as a frightening physical event for which she had been given, at best, a half-sentence of warning and a strip of old linen. This was the system. Not a crisis. The system. Her hygiene was not a personal choice. It was the precise and predictable outcome of 4 interlocking systems, each one claiming a portion of her body, her time, her knowledge, and her biology. Together, they formed a trap with no exit. The first system was time, and time belonged to the Lord, not to her. A peasant woman's time was not her own. Serfdom, the dominant organizing structure of medieval European rural life, bound her legally to land and lord. Her labor was owed before her comfort, before her health, before her hygiene. Consider the arithmetic of a single day: water collection before sunrise, 2 trips to the well or stream, each 15 to 30 minutes of walking with full buckets. Fire maintenance throughout the day, requiring fuel that first had to be gathered from surrounding land. Food preparation, grinding grain by hand, managing a fire, coordinating multiple elements in a single-pot kitchen. Agricultural labor, planting, harvesting, processing, was not seasonal in the modern sense of a contained burst followed by rest. Medieval agricultural systems required constant attention across the full year. Add textile production, the spinning, weaving, and mending of all clothing for the household, performed by women in any available margin of the day. Add child care. Add animal care. What remains after all of this is not time. What remains is the brief, exhausted space between the last task and unconsciousness. That is where hygiene lived. The myth of the leisurely medieval lady, flowing through sunlit corridors with nothing but time, applied to a fraction of medieval women. Even noble women's lives were defined by obligation, by managing complex households, by reproductive duty and its physical consequences. The image of leisure attached to medieval femininity was a literary construction, a romantic invention, a story told by men who did not know what women actually did with their days. The second system came from the Church, and the Church did not merely govern the soul. The Church did not merely govern spiritual life in medieval Europe. It governed biology. It governed the female body specifically with a consistency and authority that reached into the most intimate aspects of a woman's physical existence. Menstruation was not, in the Church's framework, a neutral biological event. It was a consequence of the fall, a mark of Eve's transgression made visible on the female body every month. Theologians wrote about it, preachers preached about it, canon law addressed the ritual implications of it. And women lived inside this interpretation of their own bodies, not as external opinion, but as the water they swam in, the air they breathed. In many regions and periods, church authorities debated whether menstruating women should approach communion, with local practice varying widely, but the underlying message consistent. The menstruating body was a body under suspicion. This was not a local custom. It was a theologically informed restriction enforced at the level of the parish priest. A woman who had not disclosed her menstrual status was understood to be committing an act of sacrilege if she approached the altar. The Church simultaneously declared her body impure and gave her no tools for managing that impurity other than withdrawal. The Church also controlled the institutions in which medical knowledge existed. Monasteries, cathedral schools, early universities, these were the repositories of written medical tradition, of the Greco-Roman texts that formed the basis of medieval medicine. Women were excluded from these institutions almost entirely. The knowledge existed. Women could not access it. The third system was medicine. And medieval medicine was built on a foundation that was almost entirely wrong. The 4 humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, were understood to be the fundamental constituents of human health, inherited from Greco-Roman antiquity and mediated through centuries of ecclesiastical interpretation. Imbalance between them caused disease. Balance restored health. The treatments that followed from this framework, bloodletting, purging, dietary adjustment, herbal intervention, occasionally worked by accident and routinely did harm. On questions of female health specifically, the humoral tradition was catastrophically inadequate. The womb was understood as a mobile organ that could wander through the body. Menstrual blood was considered toxic waste requiring expulsion, a belief that reinforced the taboos rather than explaining them. Infertility was almost always attributed to the woman, regardless of evidence. And then there was the fear of water. It was widely held and supported in a distorted way by prevailing theory that bathing opened the body's pores to miasma, the corrupted air believed to carry disease. This was not folk superstition operating outside official medicine. This was official medicine. During the plague outbreaks of the 14th century, several city governments issued formal guidance against bathing on the basis that open pores created a pathway for pestilential air to enter the body. The advice was given in good faith by the most credentialed medical authorities available. It was catastrophically wrong, and there was no mechanism by which a peasant woman could have known that. Women were warned against bathing during menstruation because cold water was believed to disturb the womb and cause infertility, against bathing after eating, during thunderstorms, at night. Every one of these prohibitions reduced the frequency of washing. Every one of them was medically endorsed. Consider the lead-based face powder called ceruse. It produced the pale, even complexion that signaled indoor status and femininity. Applied carefully to the face and neck by noble women and women of middling status, it caused, over time, skin lesions, hair loss, neurological damage. No one knew. The women applying it were following the aesthetic standards of their world with the best available information. The information was wrong. The damage was real. The fourth system was perhaps the cruelest. Not what was done to her body, but what was never told to her about it. A peasant woman in medieval Europe had no access to written instruction about her own body. Literacy rates among peasant women were effectively zero. Reading and writing were skills concentrated in the clergy and a thin layer of urban and noble class. The knowledge that existed about female hygiene, female health, female anatomy, was stored in texts that women could not read, in institutions women could not enter, in a language, Latin, that women were not taught. What women had instead was each other, oral tradition. The knowledge passed from mother to daughter during shared work, from midwife to community during childbirth, from neighbor to neighbor over fences, at wells, in the brief social moments that punctuated days of labor. This knowledge was real, accumulated over generations, often sophisticated in its practical application, the correct ratio of vinegar to water for a scalp rinse, the particular herbs that helped with menstrual cramping, the treatments for common skin conditions, the management of infections that would now be treated with antibiotics but were then managed with what was available. But it was also wildly inconsistent. Two neighbors might hold directly contradictory beliefs about whether washing during menstruation was dangerous or protective, whether hot or cold water was safer for the womb, whether rosemary or thyme worked better against lice. There was no way to adjudicate, no external authority a peasant woman could consult, no text she could check. When a woman moved through marriage into a new household or village, she left her knowledge network behind and entered a new one with no guarantee of compatibility. She adopted new practices with no basis for evaluating them. Some were improvements, some caused harm. She could not tell which was which. The girls who received no preparation for their first menstrual period, The women who used cosmetics, slowly damaging their skin. The women who avoided washing during illness precisely when it might have helped. Every one of these outcomes was the product not of individual failure, but of systemic information deprivation. The knowledge existed somewhere. It simply never reached her. Pull these four systems together. A woman born into serfdom had her time consumed by the feudal structure, her body interpreted by the church, her health mismanaged by a medicine that was confidently wrong, and her knowledge limited to whatever fragments her female community had preserved and managed to whisper forward across generations. Her hygiene was not a personal failing. It was the precise, predictable outcome of every system she lived inside. The trap had no exit. So next time you turn on a tap, hot water arriving in seconds, at a pressure you can adjust, into a basin designed for the purpose, let the contrast land, not with guilt, with awareness. The medieval woman whose life we've just walked through did not have that tap. She did not have the 2-minute shower or the shampoo formulated for her specific hair type, or the dental floss, or the sanitary pad, or the private room with the door that locks. She had cloth, she had ash. She had vinegar and a few dried herbs. She had the collective knowledge of other women who had managed before her with the same meager toolkit. And from these things, from essentially nothing, she built a functioning system. That is not a small thing. The cloth wipe, the vinegar rinse, the herbal sachet tucked inside the bodice to release fragrance with body heat, the cap that served double duty as modesty and hygiene shield, these were not the degraded remnants of some better system. They were the system, built from constraint and sustained by ingenuity, passed forward by women who received no credit for the engineering involved. Medieval women adapted to seasonal limits. They worked around scarcity of fuel, water, and time. They managed menstruation with repurposed cloth across decades. They maintained oral health with what the forest and hearth provided. They kept their families cleaner than their resources should have allowed, in the margins of days that had already taken everything. The shame and silence that surrounded female bodily functions in the medieval period, the menstrual taboos, the prohibition on discussion, the knowledge passed in fragments and whispers rather than clearly stated and openly taught, that has not entirely disappeared. In many parts of the world, menstrual products remain unaffordable or inaccessible. Access to clean water is not universal. The silence around female bodies that medieval women lived inside persists in different forms, in different geographies. The distance between that world and this one is real and vast. It was not crossed automatically. It was crossed through science, public health infrastructure, and women insisting that their bodies deserved knowledge, care, and resources. Every piece of that distance was fought for. These women deserve more than pity. They deserve recognition for what they built from nothing, maintained across decades, and transmitted forward into a future they could not see. If this video changed the way you think about medieval women, or the way you think about what you have, hit the like button. It makes a genuine difference to this channel. Subscribe if you want to go further into the history that the textbooks skipped. And leave a comment. Which part of this video shocked you the most and why? The bathing order, the menstrual taboos, the medical advice that told women to stop washing? I want to know. The conversation in the comments is always the best part. These women lived, they managed. They deserve to be seen clearly, not through the soft lens of romantic fantasy, but for exactly what they were. Real people inside impossible systems doing what had to be done.